This is a fun class, and I do love container gardening. So we're going to have a good time. Yeah. And we have all morning to do it. So if y'all have things, just woohoo, yeah. Okay. Container gardening actually dates back thousands and thousands of years. I know when you read things about container gardening now, they'll say, oh, it's one of the fastest growing areas of gardening. Well, yeah, in Egypt it was real fast growing, and it was real fast growing in Rome and in the Orient. So it's been around for a long time. And it's really good if you have limited space or if you just want to add more interest to your landscape. Containers are a great way to do that. And they can provide seasonal color. We have a lot of seasonal color here that you can put in your landscape, and it adds variety to your garden. Some of the advantages of container gardening are they are portable. I really appreciated this last year when we had those hailstorms that came through. And my husband and I were outside grabbing all my pots and sticking them up under the chairs and under the tables because my garden was just flattened. But my containers came out just fine. So you can move them if you have something happening and you want everything moved to the front of your house to say, come here. You can move those containers. They're portable. You can move them when the weather's bad. You can remove them if one starts looking not really well. You can move it to the back, move a new one up to the front. And they can be grown where a traditional garden can't be grown. You have landscaped beds that are fine, but they're going to stay there. But if you live in an apartment or if you have a very small house, a townhome or a zero lot line, you don't have a lot of room to have beautiful big lush flower beds. So you can put containers there where you can't grow a traditional garden. If you have an area that has really poor soil, you can put a container there, fix the soil in this much space, much easier than you can fix the soil in this much space. So you can grow them where you can't grow a traditional garden. You can create special growing conditions. If you have a plant that you absolutely love but really doesn't like North Texas, in our soils, like a hydrangea or an azalea or something that needs extra special care, you can make its own little extra special care in a container. You can have, you can take a container and it really takes less time and less water than a traditional garden. If we go into really bad drought restrictions, again, hopefully not ever in my lifetime, but if we do, you can go out and you can keep your containers healthy when you're watching the rest of your gardens die because of lack of water. So it really does take less time. Containers are great for all ages. It doesn't matter if you're 5 or if you're 85, you can do it. Containers are great for beginning gardeners, because a beginning gardener sometimes is very overwhelmed with the thought of, I've got to dig this garden, I've got to make it grow, I've got to make it beautiful, I've got to keep it clean. But if you're working with just one container, that's not so hard. You can do that. It's a great place to start. And if the plants in your one container die, you've got one container that you're replacing. You're not replacing an entire flower bed that you've gone out and you've spent hundreds of dollars planting and then watching it die. And if the plant in your container gets a disease, it's contains away from the other plants. So it's easier to treat that disease or keep it isolated from other plants. And it's easier to experiment with new varieties. And as master gardeners, we like to say, ooh, I'm going to try that. Well, I don't want to try that in a whole big half acre, but I can try that in a container or two and see if it really works. And then you can grow specialty plants, keep them in a special area for their seeds or to share with other gardeners. If an older gardener wants to garden, containers are perfect because it's much easier on their backs. They don't have to bend over, but depending on the height of the container, they can sit, they can work, they can move on around the containers much easier. So it's easier to do a container when they're sitting or standing and not having to move around. And they're very kid-friendly. You can give your child or your grandchild a little container and say, look, we're going to grow a vegetable garden, a very miniature garden, any kind of a garden, and say, this is yours, and let them play with it. And if something happens to it, then they learn that you can recycle in and out. So it's a great thing for kids to learn too. So we're going to talk about types of containers, the soil, cultural practices to make your containers stay healthy, and the maintenance of your container. Then we'll take a break. Then we're going to come back and talk about some design basics, the basics of dimension and scale, of texture and color. Then we're going to talk about choosing plants. How do you choose the plants that go in your container? And then what do you do? How do you design with those containers? And then we'll take another short break and then come back and we'll put some containers together. So what is a container? They can be simple, they can be elaborate, they can be traditional, they can be quirky. Anything can be a container as long as it has what? Drainage holes. They have to have drainage holes. And the other thing you want to be careful about with choosing your container is to make sure it's never had any kind of toxic elements, either sprayed on it, put in it, grown in it, because especially if you're growing any kind of a plant that you're going to eat. So make sure it has no toxic materials that have held them. So where do you get them? You get them at the hardware store. You get them at the big box store sometimes. You get them from yard sales. You get them from Amazon. You go online and you can find anything in the whole world online. So you can have various different places where you can find your containers. Hanging baskets are containers that are suspended, and they're great because they add that vertical element that you want in your gardens. You can find hanging baskets that are either wire or wrought iron, metal, and a lot of them come with their own natural liners, or you can create a liner, and we're going to talk about liners a little bit later. So there are basically two types of containers: porous and non-porous. The porous pots look a whole lot more natural, and they allow air movement. Because those containers are porous, they allow the air to move through the container to the root system of the plant. But they also can dry out more quickly because they're porous and allow the air to go through there. They can deteriorate if they're consistently exposed to moisture and freezing temperatures. So if we have some of our temperatures like we did last year, and it's 85 one day and it's 14 degrees the next day, and our containers are trying to do this, if they're real porous, they can crack. So you have to be careful of that, and they might need to be protected and brought indoors. Now, some of the porous containers that you'll find out there are terracotta. They are the ones that you see in all the beautiful magazines because they're so beautiful and visually appealing. So you can find them everywhere. They have a lot of different colors and designs, and they're also widely available. You can find terracotta containers everywhere. There are lots of different shapes and sizes. The basic unglazed terracotta pots are not expensive. The more expensive are a glazed pot. But they do need winter care because they draw mixture from the potting mix. They'll need to be watered more often because they dry out more quickly. And a lot of them only have one drainage hole. And if it's a smaller container, that's not bad. But when you have a large container that only has one drainage hole, that's probably not going to be enough. And so it's hard to get the drainage correct in some of these containers, because have you ever tried to drill a drainage hole in a terracotta pot? They don't appreciate it. They like to crack if you do that. And the less expensive ones, the lightweight terracotta, can break a lot more easily, and they're more prone to the freeze-thaw cycle that we have in the winter. They can also retain heat a long time because they're porous. For some plants, that's not a problem. But for other plants, it can kill the microorganisms that are around the roots. So you don't want that hot, and you have to be more careful in full sun situations in the summer. The clay pots can also be breakable, so you don't really want to give a very inexpensive clay pot to your 5-year-old and have him drop it and then pick up some of those shards that have the very sharp edges. Now, wooden containers, if they're redwood or they're cedar, they're relatively rot resistant. So those are good. And they can be used either like they are, or you can stain them. You want to, this is one of the things you want to be careful about in avoiding the wooden containers that have been treated with any kind of toxic compounds. Since those toxic vapors not only can harm you if you're eating something edible from that container, a lot of those toxic vapors can also damage the plants. So you want to know what those wooden containers have been treated with. They're usually light to mid-weight, so they can be moved around again. And they're very functional and beautiful when you combine them with other elements in your garden, like a wooden container next to a wooden garden bench, or next to a trellis or an arbor. The wood does help insulate the roots of those plants. Wood is a natural insulator, so that's one good thing about wood. They do require a lot of maintenance because you have to do a preventative treatment every year or so. And sometimes if you don't, that wood can split, and especially you've seen the big whiskey barrels with the iron rim around it. That can dry out and rust and fall out, and if it's got the iron or the metal nails in it, those can rust and fall out. They can, if they're not redwood or cedar, it can be susceptible to rot. So sometimes the bottom can rot out, especially if you have that sitting on the ground. So they do better if you can lift them up to give some air movement underneath it. Let's see. I think that's all for that. The wicker baskets you see everywhere, and they're really good because they're a very attractive thing. They blend in well with a lot of, especially cottage gardens and things. They're very attractive. And they provide excellent drainage. There are a lot of plants that we put in containers that really like a lot of good drainage. So wicker drains well. On the other hand, you need to line it or it drains too well, and the water doesn't stay in the basket. It does better if you can line a wicker basket with a moss or plastic to prevent all the water from just draining right out and prevent leakage to it. And a wicker basket works best if at the end of the season, dump all the potting soil, clean the basket, store it over the winter, and they'll last a lot longer. Usually wicker will last, if you leave it in the garden, 2 to 3 years, and that's it. But they're relatively inexpensive. Concrete, if you have larger plants or larger trees that you're not planning to move, concrete is a great option. But if you're planning to move it, it can be a little bit heavy. Concrete's very strong, it's very durable, and it will last years and years and years. I have a big concrete container that I have, Confederate jasmine, that's been growing out on my patio. I moved it 22 years ago to my patio, and it still grows and blooms, and it's just as happy as it can be. Because it's concrete and it's so heavy, if you have big tall plants, it's not going to blow over in the wind. And the dog's not going to run into it and knock it over. And the lawnmower's probably not going to do anything but maybe chip the corner of it. It can be stained or it can be painted, or you can leave it bare and let it get that nice patina or grow a moss on it. Concrete is porous, so it should be properly cured when you buy a concrete container. A lot of them need to be bleached to let the alkaline lime can leach out of it. So you can either just leave it outside if it's going to be rainy for a while, for a couple of weeks, let it get wet and drain out, or you can water the pot thoroughly and then let it drain, because you want to let all that lime leach out of the concrete before you really put your plants in it. Since it's porous, the soil inside that concrete pot can dry out more quickly than it does in a non-porous container. So you can either leave it like that and know that you're going to water more often, or you can seal the inside of concrete container, and that makes it more non-porous. Stone, a lot of the pictures that we see of the big elegant homes have these gorgeous big stone containers. They have loads of character, and they're very attractive, and they're ornamental. But they're also very heavy, and they're very expensive. Now they're making a lot of the faux stone containers that you see that are more lightweight, and they're very solid. They have good heat insulation, and they last a long time. Some of them are made from a stone and fiberglass mixture, which also makes it more non-porous. And they do them with the textures, and they look, like the real thing until you try to pick it up, and then it's, oh, I can pick this up. Non-porous containers have a longer lifespan, but they restrict the air movement. Remember, we said the porous containers allow air movement to come in to the root system. The non-porous containers restrict that more. They're good because they hold the moisture better than the porous, but they restrict that air movement coming through. They're more expensive than most of the porous containers, but they can withstand the likelihood of frost or freezing much better. Now, the glazed pots are the ones that you see most often in the nurseries. They require several drainage holes also. So you either have to be very careful and try to drill more drainage holes, or you have to look for glazed containers that have more drainage holes drilled in them. A lot of the ceramic pots, you'll see that they have this nice pot shape like this, coming around like this, and they have a narrow opening, and then they get wider, and then they go narrower at the bottom. And that's fine until you try to empty them, because you've got this narrow container, and it's very hard because you put a plant in it, and those roots are growing all down in here, and then you're trying to pull it through this little hole up at the top, and that's not very easy. So if you get a glazed container, try to look at the shape that you're getting and get one that, yes, you're going to put plants in it, but you're also probably going to be taking plants out of it. So don't get the ones with the little tiny tops if possible. Plastic heat and cool faster, which can be a good thing because in the summertime they warm up faster, but if it cools down at night, they also cool down faster. So the roots are not as damaged as if you put them in a container that just heats up and stays very hot. They have usually more drainage holes, or it's very easy to drill drainage holes in a plastic container. They're lightweight, they come in all sizes and all shapes, and for young children, they're a much safer alternative. You can give a child a plastic container and say, go, be happy, and deal with it. But if it's a less expensive plastic container especially, once that UV light hits it, they deteriorate. And so they may not be so pretty after a few years. But the good thing about that, you can recycle it. So if you have a plastic container and if it's deteriorating, recycle it. Don't just throw it away. Metal are very attractive. We see metal containers all over everywhere. They're very decorative and they're durable. They won't chip, they won't break, they won't crack. But they also provide very little insulation, and they can heat up rapidly, and that makes the soil dry out and increase the possibility of root damage in that container. So if you use a metal container, you want to use some kind of a liner inside that will sort of insulate it to give you more insulation between the heat and the root system. Make sure if you get a metal container, it has enough drainage holes, or you can drill drainage holes in metal. That's fine. Most of the metal containers will age very gracefully, and they'll get a patina or they'll get a green color on it. But some of them may be very heavy. You have to consider that, especially like the wrought iron, or they may rust. So if you get some of the older metal containers, some of the old-fashioned wrought iron things, you'll probably need to put a rust inhibitor on them or seal them some way. Now, weight and size. When you get your container and then you start adding soil to it, it starts getting very heavy. So the first thing you want to remember when you get a container is walk around your garden, decide where that container is going to live, place it, and then fill it, especially if it's a large container, if it is concrete or if it is metal. If you have a container like this, and you say, oh, look, I got my new container, and I've got it where I like to work, and I get it all potted up, and then you find out that container now weighs 500 pounds. It's either going to live on your patio where you planted it, or you're going to have to get everybody in the neighborhood to help you move it. So put it where it's going to live before you fill it with soil. If you have someone who lives in an apartment or has a balcony, don't encourage them to use iron or wrought iron or concrete containers, because those balconies probably don't have the weight tolerance for something that's that heavy. So if somebody asks you about that, sort of direct them more to the faux stone or to the plastic something, because you don't want them to put a big heavy container on their balcony and then have it go down to the neighbor underneath them. So if you need to move them, use container dollies to help move them. That just helps your back. That's something to remember. If you have a very tall plant, then you do want a container that has a wider base and that is heavier. I love to grow plumeria. And plumeria, you can get a plumeria stick like this, and then in a couple of years it's 8 feet tall. It drops everything in the winter. Then, so it comes in, then we take it outside, and it's just all these sticks like this. So it can be in a 10-inch container like this. And when I was first doing this, a little 10-inch container, because there's just one stick growing up. Well, we look out one day and they're all over because they've blown over, because those leaves are about this long and about this wide now. So it gets real top heavy, and then our summer wind comes in and catches it and blows it over, because the base, the container that's in, isn't heavy enough to stabilize it. So if you're going to have something that's very tall and wide, especially at the top, it needs to be in a heavy container. Now you can either, if you want it in a lightweight container so you can move it in and out of the house, then find a container that's a concrete container that you can then put it in to stabilize it once you get outside. The container that you plant needs to be larger. Larger is better. I try not to plant anything in any container that's smaller than 12 inches. Because if you have a whole bunch of little 6 and 8 inch containers, you're going to be watering them all the time because they dry out no matter what. So the larger containers will hold more water, and they don't have to be watered as quickly. And the smaller containers also restrict that root area, because once they start growing, especially when you're planting in the springtime, they're going to grow for 4 or 5 months, and the roots get very large. And if you've got them really squashed into a little bitty container, you're going to be feeding and water almost constantly because the roots are trying to grow. Then you want to consider the drainage. Water's important, but you want to avoid waterlogged soil, because your roots need water and your roots need air. And if you have too much water, then all of that airspace fills with water, doesn't leave any room for the air, which is necessary. And then what happens? Your roots rot. So you don't want to overwater your soil. So that's why I say when you get a container, if it only has one hole in it, see if you can drill more. Multiple holes are better. So in a container that's a 3 to 5 gallon container, you need at least 4 drainage holes. And at one time, our grandmothers, how many of your grandmothers broke up the old pots, put them in the bottom of the pots and said, that's what you do, that's what you do. That's what we were all taught. But then research has determined that that gradient in different materials actually impedes the drainage. So what we do now, instead of all of those pot shards that are sharp and you have to crack and break, we use coffee filters. And you put the coffee filter in the bottom of the pot, and that covers the drainage holes, and the water can seep through. Just like when you make coffee in the morning. Water goes through, holds the soil in. Then you want to raise the container off the ground. Remember we talked especially about the wooden containers. If they're sitting on the ground, the bottom of it can rot. Well, raising it allows the water to go through and drain out. Raising that container is also good in the summertime because it allows airflow to go under that so your roots don't stay quite as hot. So you can raise a container. You can go get pot feet. These are at the nursery. You put them down and that lat lifts them up. If you have old stones, old bricks, you can use that. Something to get those containers raised up to let the water go out, let the air flow through. This is important too because, yes?
I ordered some large containers and in the instructions it said I could use like some old milk cartons or different things like so I wouldn't have to just use all soil.
Mm-hmm. We'll talk, hold that thought.
Okay.
We'll get there. Yes?
On that where it says no pot shards or gravel.
Mm-hmm.
So my mom used to put the gravel in to give the pot more weight so it wouldn't blow over. Is it bad to have the gravel in there?
I would use a heavier container
That's the better
instead. Yes, yes. Now there is a place for gravel in the bottom. We'll get there too. So hold that thought too. We'll get there. If you have a container that you have put in the garden itself, which a lot of us do, it's especially important to be sure that that container also is raised up off of ground level. I went to a class at, not North Haven, Nicholson Hardy. And the instructor there was going through all these containers and he said, you know, I have had the most gorgeous Japanese maple. And I had it for like 4 or 5 years. And it grew up and it was beautiful. And I had it right over here in my garden. And then I started looking at it and it just started dying. And I couldn't figure out why. And it finally succumbed. It just said, I'm done. And then he went over and looked and he had it in his garden. But over the years, it had sunk down into the soil until it was not draining anymore. And he drowned it. I mean, Japanese maples like water, but they don't like to swim. You know, so you need, even if you've got a container in your garden, raise it up so it can drain. Now, if it's on a patio where you have natural drainage and when you water, the water does run off. If it's not too hot, if the heat doesn't get it, that's okay. I have some of mine on a patio that have brick pavers, but they have stone and sand in between the pavers. So when I water it, the water can drain out. But if you've got a container that's sitting in water that doesn't drain, it especially needs to be lifted up. Okay, now here's where we'll talk a little bit. If you don't have a drainage hole, I have a beautiful container that was my mother's. and it's a beautiful ceramic container, sort of something like this. And you say, okay, I used to plant them and give them to my mother, and she'd watch them die. Well, the way you do that is called double potting. And when you double pot somebody, you just put him in a plastic container. It might be whatever size it can fit, because you know those are going to have nice drainage holes. Then you put the plastic container inside your ceramic container. Now this is where you can use gravel, because you can put a layer of gravel in the bottom and then put your plastic container on top of it to let the water drain through, as long as the gravel is deep enough that the water doesn't get high enough that it soaks back up into that container and drown the roots. It's best if you water the plastic container, let it drain, and then put it back into the container. It's easy to combine plants that have different requirements. A lot of things, we say don't plant things that like dry conditions and things that like wet conditions. But if you have something you really want to put together, you can double pot part of it, put a container that doesn't need as much water in with whatever you've got planted, and then water around here and not water the pot that's double potted in there, so it won't get as much water. You can easily change displays. If you've got huge big containers outside your front door, you can double pot them by making an inside container, plant it all up, which is what I do, put it in your big ceramic container or whatever, and then change it out. This makes it easy when the seasons change. Or you can have multiple containers in plastic containers, and if one starts looking kind of raggedy, you take the one that you've been growing back here and change it out. It makes it much easier to change out when you have a double potting. Also, you can keep desirable but invasive plants from spreading. One thing I like to use sometimes as a spiller, and we'll get to that in just a minute, is mint. What does mint do? It shares itself everywhere. But if you plant it in its own little container, that helps keep those roots contained so it doesn't overtake everything else you've done. So that's another good thing about double potting. Now, potting soils. The first thing you need to know is do not use native soils. Do not use the soils from your garden. Don't use them. Because our soils have a very high percentage of what? Clay. Clay. Have you ever dug out in your yard and hit the hard pan or the what? That's what they have. This makes everything that makes the clay, makes the soil compact, and it makes the drainage not happen. There's not a whole lot of oxygen. There's a lot of water that gets held, and it can also have pathogens and diseases, which you don't want to introduce into your gorgeous container. So, you want to use a good soilless container mix. The main purpose of our potting mix is to hold moisture and nutrients, to allow air movement because our roots need air movement, and to provide anchorage for our little roots, something for them to grab hold of. A lot of our potting soil are often a mixture of organic and inorganic materials, and they can include peat moss, aged bark, compost, and vermiculite. Some of them can be sterilized to make sure that there are no microorganisms or weed seeds. Now, you can find some heavier mixes that have soil in them, but for our containers, we want soil less. The mixture that has potting soil or soil in it, if you have a big house plant that you don't replant very often, then that soil mix holds it in better if it's the heavier potting mix. But for what we're doing, especially for outdoor containers, you want the soilless mix because they don't contain any of the soil mineral particles like sand or silt or clay. Sometimes they're called peat light mixes because they've got some peat moss in them. But you want a good quality potting soil. You want it to be light and fluffy. Here's the light and fluffy. If you pick up a bag of potting mix and it's way heavy, it's not the best. It's either gotten too wet and you don't want it wet. If you do get some that gets wet in it, you can open it all up and spread it out on a plastic thing and let it dry out or in the sun for a day or so. But basically, if you're looking at your potting soil, you want something that's got the peat and it's got the vermiculite and it's usually got some little bark in it. And that's what we want. There are also specialized potting mixes. If you want to grow cactus or orchids or something special, you can look for the specialized potting mixes. Like an orchid mix is just basically bark because that's what they like. They have to drain real fast and they need a lot of things to hold on to with their roots. So you can find a specialized potting mix that you like. But we all know what expanded shale is, right? Okay. If you have succulents that you like to plant or lavender, things that really do like a lot of really good drainage, you can just mix in some expanded shale into your potting mix, and that's going to add some extra drainage for you for those specific things. Now, a lot of our soil mixes will say, we have fertilizer. Fertilizes up to 6 months. But you don't know how long it's been sitting on the shelf before you buy it. And once it gets out there, maybe it lasts a month in there. So we'll talk about what to fertilize with in just a minute. So yes, you can use that, but just understand that that's not going to take the place of using fertilizer in your containers. And then some of them also say moisture holding. And that also may last for a month, but you're not going to be able to go off on vacation for a month and come back and say, oh yeah, my plants are fine. They're going to have dried out and died. So now if you get your potting mix and it looks a little bit dry, you want it to be moist. I mean, this is not wet, this is moist. So if it's a little dry, water it until it's moist. Mix it all up before you use it, because you want it to have some moisture. Because if your potting mix is dry and you plant a plant in that, the potting mix is going to pull all the moisture away from your roots, from your plant. So everything that you put together needs to be moist. Okay, now we're going to talk about some cultural practices after you've decided about your container and you've chosen your soil. We've talked a little bit about watering. We know that containers require more water than a garden that's in the ground. It requires more frequent watering because the sides, if you look at the sides of this container, it's all exposed to the air, whereas in the ground, nothing is exposed to the air. So the container's all exposed. So it's going to dry out faster, so it needs more frequent watering. And as the temperatures increase, it's going to need more frequent watering. And as the plants grow, the root systems get larger, and they're going to require more frequent watering. So you need to water it slowly, and how do you tell if it needs to be watered? God gave you a moisture meter. It's cheap, it's available, it's there. What do? You stick your finger down up to about the third knuckle, down where the roots are in your container that are growing. Now the top may be sort of dry, but down where the roots are, if it's wet, you don't need to water. If it's dry, you need to water. So use your moisture meter to determine. When you water, water slowly. You need to give your plants time to soak up this water. And I always say, you're not washing your car, you don't turn your hose on full blast and go, you know, because it's going to give you this, it's either going to wash all the flowers off or the soil away, or it's just going to run off because you're watering it so fast it doesn't have time to soak in. If you find out that you're allowing it to dry out, if you've forgotten to water, and you look at your container and you see that the soil has pulled away from the edges, that means it's too dry. Then, even if you water slowly, the water's going to go to the top, it's going to go right over to the side, and right down, and right out the bottom. And you're going to say, oh, I'm watering correctly because it's flowing out the bottom. But it's not going to the center. It's going around and out the bottom. So, if you see that it has dried out, there are a couple of things you can do. A lot of things say, oh, pick up your container and stick it in a larger bucket and let it soak for 6 hours. Well, if you've got a 14, 16-inch container that's fully planted, you don't want to pick it up and put it in something that's even larger. So you can either, one thing that I like to do is take a pencil and just poke holes around close to the roots of those little plants, because then you're making little water channels. And then you water slowly, and it's going to soak in there. Then you're going to wait 30 minutes. You're going to come back and water slowly again. And that's letting it soak through until you get your soil rehydrated, because you don't want to let those little roots dry out. Another reason that we water until the water flows out is because of salt management. Number one, our water has a lot of salt in it. Number two, we're fertilizing, and the fertilizers have salt in them. So we need the fertilizer, but we need to get rid of the salt. And if you see a white crust on the top of your soil or on your container, especially on terracotta, that's the salt that's leaching out. So we have to keep that salt washed through. You can use a drip irrigation system to slowly put things in. Or I go out every morning and I talk to my plants and I water them. You know, just whatever you want, however you want to do it. You can hook up a system, determine. You don't just set the timer saying I'm going to water you for an hour every plant that I've got, because they're all different. So you have to really say this plant needs to be watered Monday, Wednesday, Friday at this level. This plant needs every day, and get your system set up that way if you're going to do that. So you still have to pay attention. But if you let your plant die out, what happens, it's a little bit like the hardening of arteries in people. The stems get thinner, and the water has a harder time soaking through. This is why we don't want to let them dry out. The same's true if the fertilizer goes away, then, or the temperatures are real high. Those little root systems and stems just sort of dry out. Okay, if you water your plants too much, you may see some yellowing or wilting leaves. You may see browning of the tips of your leaves. You may see browned or black or very limp roots if you pull them out, and they may lose their leaves, and very slow or no growth. And if the soil feels very wet to the touch and you haven't recently watered, it's too wet. You need to let it dry out. If you're underwatering, the symptoms are almost the same. So you really have to check it. You know, the only thing that's really different is if you pick up the pot and it's very light, well, you know you've underwatered. So you have to watch your watering situation, use your moisture meter, and determine what your plants want. Very tall containers give you another challenge to make the water go different. I don't know how many of you have strawberry pots and have tried to plant those. And the strawberry pots have the little holes in the side, and you plant down in the holes. And then you water, and the water just sort of goes around it. So this is called a central watering system. And it's really nothing more than a PVC pipe that you cap on one end so it doesn't just run through, and then you drill holes at different intervals around the pipe Then you put the pipe in the center, plant around it. And then when you water, you pour the water down the middle, and it goes out those holes, and it helps water all of this around. And this is what they're doing a lot with the vertical gardens that you see now. Like this one has the central line that goes down with holes, and you water through the top, and then it disperses all that water out through the side. That's called a central watering system. You would need to go to Amazon. Probably Wave. It's a central watering system.
What's that tower called?
That I'm not sure what the name of that tower is called. It is. But if you'll Google it, it'll pop up. Google's good for a lot of stuff. Lots of shopping is good.
A lot of those plants that you can get if you go to Lowe's.
Uh-huh.
Also, they've got a really nice one that goes on a wall.
Mm-hmm.
That's and they've got another one that you can build out of an old shoe rack.
Right. If you'll just check vertical gardens, because this is one of the new things that are coming in, and a lot of the big box stores have the kits that you do the wall systems, and they've got all the watering all set up, or they'll show you how to do the drip irrigation systems to go around. Yes, ma'am.
You say, I guess I missed that on the salt management.
Mhm.
You see the salt, what do you do, just rinse it off?
Yeah. Yeah. You can scrub off the container, and at the end of the season when you clean your containers, you wash all that off. But that's the main thing, is to get that salt out of the roots system.
But why, if you've got a plant that's in there, and you start seeing it, just kind of,
If it's on the top, if it's got salt all the way across the top, I would scrape that off, put new potting soil on the top, and scrub the outside of the container just with water and a brush, just to get rid of it. Okay? All right, fertilizing. Because we've got plants that are really growing and they're really happy and they're getting bigger and their roots are getting bigger, they need food. You don't just plant something and say, grow, be happy. I mean, I have neighbors who'll do that. You know, they'll get something, they'll plant it, and I don't see them again. And I just watch those plants die because they're starving to death. And you just, you know, if you're going to spend the money to buy a plant, feed it. It's like going to the pet shop and buying a puppy and bringing him home and say, grow, dog. You know, if you don't ever feed it or do anything to it, he's not going to be very happy. Well, your plants are not either. So, what we're suggesting, because they're growing so fast and because we're watering, and we're watering till the water goes out the bottom, that fertilizer depletes rapidly. So, use a slow release fertilizer, even though it says it's in your potting mix. When you plant it, use a slow release fertilizer and then put in more slow release fertilizer about once a month, just to keep this steady going. You know, look at the instructions on the package and don't put in a cup of fertilizer in an 8-inch pot. Read the instructions and just a little fertilizer, and then also use a water-soluble fertilizer. I always say that the slow release is meat and potatoes. We have to have that. The water-soluble is candy. We want a zap of sugar. This is going to make it grow and bloom and be happy. You use the water-soluble, the water-soluble fertilizers about every 10 days, 2 weeks. And if you use the slow release and you forget the water-soluble, your plants are probably going to be okay because they've got this long-term, consistent. So if you forget, you can say, oh, I'm killing my plant. Well, no, just go back and water it.
what brand do you use?
Any good brand. any good brand. Yes. 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 Any good Yeah, you don't want to over fertilize or under. So you use a nice water soluble whatever. You can use, okay, I admit. When you store your fertilizers, especially your slow release, store it in a tightly sealed container. Most of them come in a container either with a zip or you put it in a Ziploc inside the zip, just so it stays dry. And if you do that, it should last almost indefinitely. Now, when you fertilize in the summertime, you want to, about midsummer, make sure you're giving them the right amount because they're really growing faster. So you might want to, if you're giving the water-soluble fertilizer every 2 weeks, you might want to say, I'm going to give it every 8 to 9 days, just because they're growing so fast in the summer, and we're watering more in the summer, so we're washing more fertilizer out. Now, but it's different in the fall because the weather's cooler. And so we're not going to be watering as much, so we don't need to fertilize quite as much. So it may even be sort of unnecessary once we get them planted because they don't live as long. But in the summertime, pay attention to how much you're fertilizing. You can use organic fertilizers like fish emulsion or a blood meal, but a lot of the organics are more for long term. We're doing a container that we want short-term bloom, so it may not really do enough good for your containers to use an organic because it takes longer and because a lot of them don't smell very good. And if you put a great fish emulsion on something that's right at your front door and you invite people in, they may go the other way. It's just, that's me. Now, the thing that you never want to use is your husband's yard fertilizer. If he says, oh, I got this bag of fertilizer at the big store and it was on sale for $3 and I got 50 pounds of it and I'm going to put it everywhere, it's going to be too strong for all the plants in your container. It's going to burn the roots. So never use the lawn fertilizer. Did I have a question back there? Whoever, call the guy. Just call the guy. Whoever likes to do it. If it were up to me, I would have no lawn at all. But my husband loves his lawn, so that's why I say my husband, and he gets out there and he. That's whoever draws the short straw and has to do the fertilizing of the lawn. That's it. Okay. Light. Light is critical. Plants may not bloom if there's not enough light, and if they get too much light, they'll scorch and burn. So before you place your container, look again where it's going to live and consider the light level in the location where that container is going to be planted. Then you want to, here's a great thing, it's called a plant label. When you purchase your plant, you want to check the plant label. And it says, this one's easy, it says sun to shade. We got no problem. That's fine. This one says sun to light shade. Some of them may say full sun. Now the caveat is a lot of these plants are grown in North Carolina or in Michigan or in Oregon, and full sun in Michigan is not full sun in Texas. Yes.
I was looking at the label and it said full sun, and I said, well, I've got some shade. He said,
Yes.
that label's
If,
not for here.
a lot of places you'll go and you'll see a Japanese maple and it'll say full sun. Yes, oh dear me. We had a lady come to the garden show one year and she said, oh, I'm having a horrible time. She had just moved down from Connecticut. And she said, we got all these gorgeous Japanese maples and we planted them all around our swimming pool. And that's what we said. Oh no. And they all died Because full sun up there, Japanese maples are fine, but full sun down here, they won't last 2 weeks. So take that into consideration when you're buying plants. The good thing about containers, if you see something that's getting too much sun, you can move it. You can move it over. When I have geraniums, and they're gorgeous in the spring in the full sun, and then I start inching them over to more shade and more shade and more shade through the summer, so they'll make it. So even if it says full sun, know about the afternoon shade that we have here. Then consider the plant itself. If you have a whole bunch of plants that say full sun, you've got a really big center plant, the plants behind it are going to get shaded. So they're not going to get the same amount of light. So you're going to have to turn that container, which you can do, to make sure all your plants are getting the right light levels. Then you want to remember reflected sunlight. I have a patio that's got brick. It's in the sort of a U-shaped wall around it. And the sun, west sun, is shining on there and down on the patio. I have plants on that patio. One summer I was out there and the outside temperature was 104. The temperature on that patio with all that reflected sunlight was 125. So remember where you're placing your plants. If you have a swimming pool that light's going to reflect off of to kill those Japanese maples, or if you have a brick wall that the light's going to hit and reflect off of, remember that and consider what you're putting there and make sure that it's getting some afternoon shade to make your plants happier. Then also consider our winds. When we have our southwest winds come through in the summertime, they can dry a container out in 30 minutes. So you just have to watch. You have to be careful and watch. Now, we're going to take care of our plants by deadheading them and pruning them. A lot of the newer plants, you don't really have to deadhead. They're self-deadheading, means the flowers just fall off and new flowers grow, and you're all happy. If you have to deadhead, then you want to get just some little snippers and go out and snip some of the heads off of them. If you have herbs, you want to cut the herbs, you want to harvest them, use them, and if you have too many, then clip them off. I mean, you need to clip it off and give them a haircut. That's a neat thing, because if you don't, they're going to flower and then they're going to go to seed and then they're not going to make flowers. So when you cut them off, when you trim it back, it's encouraging new growth and it's encouraging new flowers. So even though you say, oh, I've got new flowers and I'm about to cut them off because it's gone out long and lanky this way, but when you cut it off, then it's going to bush out and it's going to get fuller and it's going to look a lot better. And especially in the summertime, if you've got hanging baskets and you see that they're getting long and lanky, or your containers are getting long and lanky, give them a haircut. You get a haircut in the summer. Give your plants a haircut in the summer. Your hair grows back. Most of our hair grows back. So give them a haircut and take care of them. Then at the end of the season, especially for our annuals, you want to take the container, dump it into the compost pile, because our annuals won't make it through the winter. So you put it in the compost pile, clean those containers, especially your terracotta. You want to clean them out with 10% solution of bleach, 10% bleach and water. Scrub them down, turn them upside down, and store them for the winter or on their sides. Then if you have really big containers like the cement, you can, and if you're cleaning out what's in those containers, you can also clean those down and then cover them either with plastic or some kind of a top to keep the rain out of it for the winter if you want to. Now, if you have some things that you would like to overwinter, it's not very easy, but it can be done. You have to really pay attention to watering in the winter because it's cold and those roots can desiccate if they don't get enough water in the winter time. So winter watering and protection are going to be needed. And if you have tender perennials or if you have annuals that you want to keep, they need to be moved inside. How many of you have a greenhouse? No, how many of you have a greenhouse? Do you see these people that have a greenhouse? Get to be their friends. And say, I have 14 plumeria plants that need to go inside. Would you like to keep some? If not, then you have to figure out what it is you're going to do with your container. If they're hardier, if they're a good perennial, you can just heavily mulch it. Sometimes you can wrap it in a burlap. You can move them indoors, give them a good trim, a haircut. I have a ficus tree that I'll cut down about 2 feet off the top of it to get it into the house for the winter. And move it inside. But a lot of our perennials, because they don't grow as fast in a container, at the end of the season, you can just take it out and plant it in the garden, and it grows in the garden. You can treat it as an annual and say, I've loved you for 6 months. Good, now go and become compost and make the earth happy. Or you can take the whole, if it's not a huge container, you can take the whole container, dig a big hole, put the container down in the hole, and pull the soil all the way around it, and that way the soil temperature in that container is the same as the soil temperature all around it, and it will last better, and then in the next season, you'll pull it out, clean off the outside, and yes?
Do you think there are any perennials that are in containers that would survive above ground in the container?
Yes, ma'am. If you find a perennial that you want to keep, make sure that perennial is rated for at least 2 zones colder than ours. We're in zone 8, zone 7. So if you find a perennial that is hardy to zone 5 or 6, it's probably going to be fine, as long as you keep it watered. Okay? Now, if you try to keep things outdoors especially, they're not going to need as much fertilizer in the wintertime. Even our indoor plants need some downtime. They need some time to recuperate because they really stop actively growing all winter long, so you don't need to fertilize them every month until the springtime. Break time. Let's take a break.